Hi, this is Allie, and this is my history final. To start out, we're going to do Plessy versus Ferguson, which was argued on April 13th, 1896, and decided on May 18th, 1896. Plessy versus Ferguson upheld state racial segregation laws for public facilities under the doctrine of separate but equal. Full case name is Homer A. Plessy versus John H. Ferguson. The decision was handed down by a vote of 7-1, with the majority opinion written by Justice Henry Billings Brown and the dissent written by Justice John Marshall Harlan. Connected to Plessy versus Ferguson, we have the Jim Crow South. Jim Crow was the name of the racial caste system, which operated primarily but not exclusively in southern and border states between 1877 and the mid-1960s. Along with that, we have de jure and de facto segregation. De jure segregation is a separation enforced by law, while de facto segregation occurs when widespread individual preferences, sometimes backed up with private pressure, lead to separation. Next, we're going to talk about the NAACP, Thurgood Marshall, Little Rock 9, Brown v. Board of Education 1 and 2, SNCC, Sit-In, and Stokely Carmichael. Thurgood Marshall was the first African American Supreme Court justice serving from 1967 to 1991, and throughout the height of the Civil Rights Movement. As a lawyer, he led the argument for Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, leading to the desegregation of public schools. Speaking of which, the Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka was a landmark United States Supreme Court case in which the court declared state laws establishing separate public schools for black and white students to be unconstitutional. It was argued December 9, 1952, re-argued December 8, 1953, and decided on May 17, 1954. Brown v. Board of Education 2 was a Supreme Court case decided in 1955, ordering schools to desegregate with all deliberate speed. It was argued April 11th through 14th of 1955 and decided on May 31st, 1955. There were many student protests that happened during the Civil Rights Movement, including the Little Rock 9 and sit-ins. The Little Rock 9 was a group of 9 African American students enrolled in Little Rock Central High School, and sit-ins were African American protesters who sat down at segregated lunch counters and refused to leave until they were served. Speaking of students, the SNCC, otherwise known as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, was a U.S. civil rights organization formed by students and active especially during the 60s, whose aim was to achieve political and economic equality for blacks through local and regional action groups. This was the most important organization of the civil rights movement. Moving on with the SNCC, Stokely Carmichael was a civil rights activist and national chairman of the SNCC in 1966 and 1967. All this ties into the NAACP, otherwise known as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and it's a civil rights organization in the U.S., founded in 1909 as a biracial organization to advance justice for African Americans by W.E.B. Du Bois, Mary White Ovington, and Moorfield Story. Its mission in the 21st century is to ensure the political, educational, social, and economic equality of rights of all persons and to eliminate racial hatred and racial discrimination. Moving on to protests, we have Rosa Parks, the Montgomery bus boycott, and Martin Luther King Jr. Rosa Parks was a black seamstress from Montgomery, Alabama, and in 1955, she refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery city bus to a white person, as she was legally required to do, and was arrested and fined for violating segregation laws. Martin Luther King Jr. was an American civil rights activist and Baptist minister who first rose to prominence as a leader of the Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott, challenging segregated transportation. The Montgomery bus boycott was a seminal event in the civil rights movement and was a political and social protest campaign against the policy of racial segregation on public transit systems of Montgomery, Alabama. Now we're moving on to protests, so we will be talking about the SCLC, Birmingham Campaign, March on Washington, and the Selma Campaign. The SCLC was an African American civil rights organization that organized and sponsored many protest marches and demonstrations during the late 1950s and 1960s. The Birmingham Campaign was a movement organized in early 1963 by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, also known as the SCLC, to bring attention to the integration efforts of African Americans. March on Washington was a march to stand up for the civil and economic rights for African Americans during a time when racism was more prevalent throughout society. And the Selma Campaign were 3 protest marches along the 54-mile highway from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama. Now we're going to talk a little more on MLK. Martin Luther King Jr. did make an impact on the civil rights movement. He did write the Letter from Birmingham Jail, which was a letter written by MLK on April 16, 1963. The letter defends the strategy of nonviolent resistance to racism. There's also the assassination of MLK Jr. He was assassinated on April 4, 1968, fatally shot at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. Moving on towards more about civil rights, we're going to talk about CORE, Freedom Rides, Civil Rights Act of 1964, Civil Rights Act of 1968, Malcolm X, and the Nation of Islam. CORE, otherwise known as the Congress of Racial Equality, was an African American civil rights organization in the United States that played a pivotal role for African Americans in the civil rights movement. Lasting from May 4th to December 10th, 1961, a group of 13 African American and white civil rights activists launched the Freedom Rides, a series of bus trips through the American South to protest segregation in interstate bus terminals. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited discrimination because of race, religion, national origin, and gender. The Civil Rights Act of 1968 defined housing discrimination as the refusal to sell or rent a dwelling to any person because of his race, color, religion, or national origin. Malcolm X was an African American political leader of the 20th century for the NOI, otherwise known as the Nation of Islam, and an advocate for armed self-defense. The Nation of Islam was a black Muslim political and religious movement founded in Detroit. Our final section is about voting acts and groups who are pro-all-people vote. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was a law passed at the time of the Civil Rights Movement. It eliminated various devices, such as literacy tests, which were used to restrict voting by black people. Freedom Summer was a volunteer campaign in the U.S. launched in June 1964 to attempt to register as many African American voters as possible in Mississippi. Black Power is a political slogan and a name for various associated ideologies aimed at achieving self-determination for people of African descent. And finally, Black Panthers were a revolutionary and socialist organization founded by Bobby Seale and Huey Newton in October 1966.